Welcome to the Private Practice Startup Podcast, where we help ambitious private practitioners across the globe to brand themselves and grow their dream practices. We chat with successful private practitioners, business coaches, and marketing experts, bringing you tons of practice building ninja tips. Visit privatepracticestartup.com for awesome resources, attorney-approved private practice paperwork, and our signature marketing e-course. Here are your co-hosts, Dr. Kate Campbell and Katie Lemieux.
Hey there, Startup Nation. Welcome back to another episode of the Private Practice Startup Podcast. We are delighted that you are here. And we have a very special guest today. I will introduce her in a second. But if this is your first time here, we hope that you're going to stay, and we're welcoming you into the Startup Nation family. It is an honor to have you here. And we have over 200 podcasts. So if this is your first time listening, there's plenty to listen to. We also have a gift for you. If you head on over to privatepracticestartup.com, like it or not, we all need paperwork. We have a free paperwork course that also includes a free copy of our attorney-approved private practice HIPAA form. So that is our gift to you, and that is under the resources section on the Private Practice Startup. We hope that you guys joined us last week as we talked to Catherine McGowan from CPH-INS. If that sounds familiar to you, you're thinking, where do I know that company name? That is a liability insurance company here in the U.S. So if you do have your liability insurance with them, or you're just wondering how to protect your practice and avoid the most common insurance claims, you'll definitely want to check that out. So our guest today is Kimberly Grosher, LCSW, CPC, RYT, psychotherapist, executive coach, and yoga teacher. Kimberly's company is Life by Design Therapeutic and Coaching Services. She is also an alumni of our coaching program, and we have such a dear place in our heart for her. Kimberly is a licensed clinical social worker, and she practices both in New York and Florida. She's an adjunct professor at the Columbia University School of Social Work, where she teaches social work foundations, power, race, oppression, and privilege. Kimberly enjoys working with professional women, entrepreneurs, and couples, helping them design lives that allow them to thrive professionally while being emotionally, spiritually, and physically healthy. Fun facts about Kim: she's a travel addict and definitely cannot wait to get back. So today we're talking about the impact of racial discrimination on mental health. Welcome, Kimberly.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here.
We're very excited that you're here, and it's nice. We got to connecting before we hit record, so it was nice to catch up. So where should we dive in on this topic? I know it's huge, broad, and I was going to say decades, but no, centuries. So where do you want to dive in?
Well, and first off, before we dive in, tell us how this topic became a passion of yours.
So actually, I think it's been grounded. If I think back, like I knew when I was in high school that I wanted to be a therapist, and I knew I wanted to work with families of color. And I didn't have all the language or all the knowledge that I have now, but I just knew there was something about being a person of color in this country and having a different experience. And then I did my MSW at Howard, which was like a whole grounding and all of this, and really just got me on fire for it. And then also just looking at people I know, women I know who are Black women, who are women of color, and how their struggle with mental health looks very different than maybe some other communities that I've worked with. And so that really kind of drew me in further. And then I was asked to teach this course at Columbia, which initially I was like, because it's a very controversial course, it's loaded. But after teaching it for a couple of years now, I definitely think it's something that every mental health professional needs to take. Mm-hmm. So that's a little bit of my journey up to this point.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. And then I think maybe this is kind of like a good segue into the topic is, please share with us, obviously, as two white women never having that experience of, what do people of color go through when it comes to mental health? What are their, unique difficulties, whether accessing mental health services or even in the client-therapist relationship or other things that I'm not even aware of?
Oh my goodness. Okay. So let's start with just racial discrimination on a person's mental health, period, right? So, and then within that, we have different levels. So mostly as therapists, we're dealing with the interpersonal level. So when you're thinking about racial discrimination, this can lead to stress and physical health issues as well as mental health issues. There are a lot of studies that have shown that greater exposure to racial discrimination leads to increased stress as well as increased risk of depression, among other mental health illnesses. Something that people are just starting to really talk about, that, but it's really prevalent, are microaggressions, and microaggressions in education, microaggressions in the workplace, and just really having to bear that, sit with that, and not always being able to address that, right? So we know one of the things that's great about therapy is that, just even coming in and being able to talk about things and get them off your chest can be so helpful. So imagine somebody experiencing these things on a daily basis and not really having anywhere to put it. What that does. Yep.
Can you talk to us a little bit about microaggressions and what the term means, and then also how that can pop up in different types of contexts?
Okay, so microaggressions are subtle comments, innuendos geared towards people of marginalized populations that really kind of are informed by biases we have about these groups. And so a lot of times when people think of racism or racist remarks, they think of very blatant, outright things, obviously like police brutality, run-ins with white supremacist groups, things like that. And they don't really associate with microaggressions with racism. And a lot of times people that actually make these microaggressions or these comments don't realize what they're saying. They may not be saying it, with the intention of hurting anybody or anything like that, but that's the impact. And so an example might be talking to somebody and commenting on how well they speak English. I know one of the ones I hate a lot are when people say, "Oh, you're so articulate," because it's almost like, well, did you expect me to not be able to speak? Did you expect me not to be articulate? What else are some other ones? Asking people, what country are you from? Implying that maybe they don't belong here, that they can't be from this country. One of the things that I see a lot of times in the classroom, and again, that maybe instructors may not realize that could be perceived as a microaggression, but commenting on how well somebody writes as if it's a surprise, that, wow, this is really great. This is really well written, especially at higher levels in academia where it's kind of expected that you know how to write. So those are just a few examples of microaggressions that can show up.
Gotcha. And I'm curious for people of color looking for a therapist, right? So one of the things I think about is, people in the LGBTQ community, right? So there's ways that therapists, they might have the rainbow flag or they might say something. So for a person of color, when they're looking for a therapist, is how can, whether it be a white therapist or any other therapist, let them know, hey, it's okay to talk about race, you're definitely welcome. Anything is going to be discussed. How do we do that as clinicians to just say it's okay? You know what I mean? Because I'm sure, and you tell me, Kimberly, so a person of color, some might be saying well, I might not want to go to a white therapist or someone who doesn't share my own experiences. So how do we just open that door, even before a person of color ever meets us, to be inviting and inclusive?
So I think, and you'll probably love this, I think this is where marketing messages are so key, right? So even before somebody gets in the door, having something in your marketing that is inclusive or kind of lets people know that you're aware or that you're open to working with different groups is really important. And a lot of times I think as therapists, we get intimidated by marketing and, it's like, oh, it's a lot of work. This is not something I know how to do. But in this specific example, this is a great way of understanding marketing as letting people know that your services exist and where you come from, in terms of your philosophy on things or how you work or what you're open to discussing or working on with somebody, in treatment. And so with marketing messages, having culturally relevant marketing. So like things like your images, where you choose to market, as well as collaborations with community institutions. What else? In terms of like, once they're in your office, I always suggest, like, in the initial session, usually when we're doing a psychosocial assessment or biopsychosocial evaluation, we ask people about their identities, whether it's race, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's gender, sexuality, so forth and so on. And so that's a great time to have the discussion. I just want to get your thoughts about, how you feel about working with me. This is how I identify. And again, you're bringing it into the room, but you're putting it onto the client. The client may not care, right? But you've opened the door and they can kind of tell you, oh, that doesn't make a difference to me, blah, blah, blah. Whereas somebody else that maybe is cautious about it, or maybe didn't even realize that they do care, that gives them the opportunity to say, well, this might be a concern that I have, or this is something I'm going to need from you in our work together. And when I teach my students to have these conversations, one of the things I always point out to them, it's not about you having all the answers. It's about your client knowing and trusting that you can tolerate to have these conversations. A lot of times I hear from clients of color that they are really skeptical or worried about bringing these matters up in the in the therapy office, because they feel like either the therapist is going to take offense, they're afraid that the therapist may not want to talk about it, or that they're going to discourage them from talking about it, or it's going to be a really rejecting and invalidating experience. So I think it's really important that your client knows that, like, I'm open to talking about this. I see it. I recognize it, and I'm here for it.
Yeah, thank you for that. And, one of the things that Kate and I have been doing is really looking at our own business and our own company and really assuring that we're being inclusive. And, one of the places that we actually decided to look back at is our paperwork, right? And like, are we asking all the things that you had just talked about? And I was like, wow, we're missing some stuff here. And one of the things that Kate and I always talk about is really paperwork is not just something that has to get done, but it invites a conversation, right? So if I'm asking you about these things on the paperwork, you're filling it out. And I always find it interesting because a lot of times if clients are uncomfortable, like I'll find this on the suicide question a lot, right? Like if they maybe have been having suicidal ideations, they interestingly will skip that, or the question about drugs, they'll skip that. So it's always an indication to me, but if it's there, it's like we've already opened the door. So I love like how you talk about like with the marketing, whether it's on your website where you're marketing through paperwork is a great way. And then when they get in there is just making that part of the initial process. It's just what you do. So I appreciate that feedback, and that's really helpful. So before we continue, I think we'll just take a quick sponsor break and continue our discussion.
Okay, guys, it's sponsor time. You know what? Instead of reading a script about Gusto's payroll and benefits, we wanted to tell you what small business owners say, the people who use Gusto every day. Here's what one small business owner says. With Gusto, I think of payroll as a 30-second job. The website is so friendly and a joy to use. Friendly payroll? You don't hear that every day. And how about Amy from Utah? Amy says, I love Gusto so much. It's so painless. It's like going to the spa, and we have great options and rates, even though we're a super small team. Like going to the spa? Wow. And here's what Mneet says about Gusto's support team. Whenever something comes up, I reach out and literally 24 hours later, they tell us what to do or assure us that we've already handled it. Smart technology and friendly humans, that's super cool. Honestly, the list goes on, and right now our listeners get 3 months free when they go to gusto.com/PPS. Yep, 3 months of payroll, benefits, administration, and more, totally free. Again, that's gusto.com/PPS.
When it comes to keeping your practice organized, you want software that's not only simple, but the best. We recommend Therapy Notes. Their platform lets you manage notes, claims, scheduling, and they have a new awesome telehealth platform for your online counseling sessions. They offer amazing unlimited phone support and email support, so when you have a question, they are there to help. To get started with the practice management software trusted by over 60,000 professionals, go to therapynotes.com and start a free trial today. Enter promo code PPS, as in Private Practice Startup, and they will give you 2 months to try for free. Go to therapynotes.com.
So Kimberly, share with us another area where racial discrimination impacts mental health?
Okay, so definitely at the institutional level, right? So what I think a lot of people are just starting to realize with the things that have happened in the last couple of months is that racism is not just something that happens person to person. It's something that's embedded in our society. It's embedded in our institutions. It's embedded in the way we do things and how we go about life in this country. And so racism, or institutional racism, structural racism, whatever you want to call it, can impact socioeconomic mobility for Black communities, communities of color in this country. And so as a result, that impacts how your access to resources, that impacts your living conditions and things like that, which we know as therapists, those things impact your mental health, right? So an example might be with all of the things, the economic downturn that has happened over the last couple of months due to COVID-19, right? So a lot of small Black businesses have had a really hard time getting funding because of some of these institutional racist practices that have been embedded in our banking system, right? So then that affects whether or not you're able to keep your business afloat. That impacts your finances. We know finances is a huge contributor to mental health issues, right? And so thus there's the domino effect with that. And then there's also internalized racism, right? So seeing these negative messages about your group or your community can really impact how people feel about themselves. Not everybody, but many people. And then that can affect your self-esteem. That can affect how you see your worth. And in turn, that can impact mental health. I'd also like to point out that, these are not just, it's not that everybody walking around who identifies as Black or identifies as a person of color is depressed or anxious because of these things, or, these are just kind of guidelines. And I'd also like to point out a lot of times people may not be aware of how it's affecting them. It may not be top of mind. So when you're sitting with a client and you're thinking about these things, this may not be in their frame of reference. And so like things like George Floyd's death, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so forth and so on over the last couple of months really bring up a lot of things for people that they didn't even know were there. And so a lot of times it's like an internalized trauma response. And I think that's important to, one, be curious about as a clinician and not just assume that everybody's in your office is having the same experience. But also, it kind of informs the questions you ask. It informs how you go about addressing treatment with a client.
What would you recommend about the best ways to open the door to start having some of those conversations? And it might be different recommendations for our BIPOC community versus our white community. So I'm just curious to hear your perspective.
So I think with everything that's happened, it's kind of on most people's minds. So there's a natural leeway in of just, even just something as simple as, I just want to check in with you and see how you're doing with everything that's happening in our world, right? Because then they can kind of take it from there with what's affecting them, how it's affecting them, and things like that. In terms of outside of these type of incidents, well, first of all, that's something else, right? So we say outside of these incidences, but for many people, this is their lived experience. This is ongoing. This is not just like May 2020, June 2020. This is happening. This is ongoing.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to ask questions in the intake or even as sessions go along. How do you think things that are happening in your community or in our society or are impacting how you feel right now, or what's happening for you? It's time for therapists to really start to take what we think of as macro and bring it down to a micro level, because they really are tied together.
For sure.
Thinking about our clients in the context of the society, the communities, their life experiences, in terms of what else they're bringing into the therapy room.
And I appreciate that. I feel like sometimes, as a therapist, like we can get so micro on like why they're there. And especially being a couples counselor, we're talking about the relationship, you know what I mean? There's so much work to do. Sometimes it's like we forget to, I know I had forgotten to take a step back and be like, overall, how are you doing? Like what you said with everything that's going on in the world. And then I would encourage like a follow-up question. And if they might just talk about COVID, I would then say, well, what about like the systemic racism stuff too? Just to assure that I'm not missing, like maybe they felt uncomfortable or something like that. And then I stepped over it too, because they didn't bring it up. I want to make sure that I would bring that up as well. And then I like really just inviting any conversation around all of that stuff. Because you're right. Like sometimes we do get so micro in our work and just really forget to take a step back.
It's always amazing to me how tied all of this is, for all of us. I think there are definitely, different. I'm sorry, I moved the bracelet. I'll go back and say that again. I think it's really interesting how, tied all of this is micro, macro for all of us. And there are different nuances and different perspectives based on our different identities, but it really does impact us all.
And as you talk, Kimberly, like, I just want to acknowledge for a moment for obviously all of our community, our therapists, that it's kind of a hard time to be a therapist in the world, right? Dealing with the stress of COVID, dealing with obviously all the systemic racism that continues, but managing our own emotions around that. Some folks are home with kids and, feeling isolated themselves as a therapist, yet are, having to show up and be available for other people and their clients. Like, I just want to acknowledge that it's a tough time to be a therapist, and it's, our work has always been important. And I just, I'm always like communicating like self-care. And I know, Kimberly, you said you need your own self-care, so you took a week off.
Yeah, it's true. And there's like so many things happening right now. There are multiple things going on that we're experiencing with our clients,
Yeah.
And so it's like you're trying to help people through this, but then you're also experiencing it.
Yeah.
And so it's a really interesting time. And it's a really I agree. This is a difficult time to be a therapist right now.
Talk to us, if you would, Kimmy, just a little bit about your experience of navigating that, because it is a simultaneous process, both with COVID and then also with the systemic racism.
Wow. How have I been navigating that? Well, I don't really see it as a choice. I think it's just something, I'm sure there is a choice in there if I really thought about it, but for me, it just feels like this is a part of my purpose and this is why I'm here. And especially with dealing with anti-Black racism, systemic racism right now, for me, this is part of my lane. This is a part of my work. So I look at it like that even if I don't have all the answers or I can't fix it for my clients, I think them just having a safe space to really process it and not have to worry about, am I saying the right thing? Am I using the right vocabulary? Is there going to be some type of backlash or reprimand? If I'm angry, if I'm upset, if I curse, if I cry, if I whatever. And I think just being able to give people that space to do that is so powerful and makes me feel good as a clinician. But then I also have to take care of myself. And I also have, my support system, taking time for myself that I have to rely on and fill myself back up too. I also think that it's really helpful for clients keeping boundaries in mind, but for them to also see that, you're experiencing this too. Not that you're necessarily falling apart in the session, that's not what it's about, but letting them know that you understand because you're also experiencing it. And there's like in this situation, I think that therapists showing some vulnerability is actually really helpful to the clients too.
And And that's always I think it's an art to manage that, right? In the sense of, you know, being vulnerable, sharing, and then not making it about you, right? And
it is
bringing it back to the client. But for sure, you know, our clients definitely want to know that we're real people too, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. You're right. It is an art, and it is a dance, and it's something that I still think we have to have our clinical hats on when we do. But I do think that there's more of a need for it right now.
Thank you. I'm curious about also with clients in the BIPOC community, and I know that we can't speak for all experiences, but what are some messages that they just even receive from their families about accessing like mental health services? Is that like you should be able to deal with on your own, or it's family, or like help enlighten us about that so we can understand that difficulty in accessing, or the culture, like what does the culture say?
Okay. So like you just said, there's a whole lot of stigma.
It's a whole lot
around seeking mental health care in BIPOC communities, right? And it's interesting that we're talking about this now because July is Minority Mental Health Month, right? So I'd like to start by kind of going back a little bit and just letting therapists know that in order to deal with stigma, you first have to understand where the stigma comes from, right? And so one of the reasons that stigma exists in BIPOC communities is that BIPOC communities are like a lot of non-Western communities. So, you know, more Eastern philosophy and things like that. There's much more of a value on collectiveness and community, right? So everybody working together, everybody helping each other. If you're an individual, like not that the individual isn't recognized, but that the individual contributions enrich the group, right? And so there's this kind of idea that you get your support and you get your help from your community. Because in a lot of places historically, you have not been able to go outside the community and trust the help that you get, right? Or it hasn't really been there. If anything, it's been detrimental, which is why you go back to the community. Whereas with therapy, you know, therapy, if you look at our roots across social work, psychology, psychiatry, whatever, it's very much grounded in the individual. We call it individual therapy. It's very much focused on the individual. So there's that. I know with Black Americans in this country, there's a history of being abused and exploited by the medical community. And so therapy is largely grounded in the medical model, right? So there's like this historical distrust. And then we get to the idea, which a lot of my research focuses on mental health in Black women and looking at these ideas of strength and resiliency, and not really being a value and not really being a necessity. And this idea that seeking therapy or seeking some type of help is a sign of weakness, right? And so some of these ideologies are starting to shift, which is great. But I do think that as a profession, we need to look at where these stigmas come from and not just look on dispelling myths, but actually, you know, redoing some of our practices and our structures and things like that to really help with dismantling stigma around seeking mental health treatment. Also, I think it's important to bring it into the treatment room when a client comes to you that comes from a BIPOC community. You know, putting that right up front. What are your thoughts about seeking treatment? Do the people in your life know that you're seeking therapy? You know, is stigma going to impact our work at all? What can I do to support you around this? You know what I mean? Is this something that you're sharing or you want to share? Or is this something that you're just keeping between, you know, to yourself for now? So really kind of understanding what your clients' ideas are, because even though they're in the office with you, it doesn't necessarily mean that they've worked through their own stigma around getting treatment.
I like those examples of questions that you just shared as ways to open up the door to have those conversations.
Yeah, and I'm noticing for me as we go through these podcasts on these topics, you know, as a therapist, I would want to kind of, we have our own like systems and the way we have our introduction session. And, these are just some really great questions that I would encourage, our audience members who are listening to begin to kind of put some questions together, that this is like part of your intro of like how you introduce yourself to your clients in the process, and tackling some of these things so they know that the door is open. Whether it's an issue now or not, but, that's really important. I know even as a couples therapist, sometimes when you bring up sex in a relationship, even though people are having sex, it's like they're still uncomfortable talking about it, but it's like, well, we're going to talk about it. You know what I mean? So it's interesting. So, I just really see, the importance of just opening it up, putting it on the table. Here it is. Whatever it is, so people have the opportunity to share.
Exactly. And then the client will decide what they want to do with it, right?
Yeah.
So we open the door and they decide if they want to walk through, or they say not yet, or no, that door doesn't apply to me. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right. Awesome. Well, Kimberly, what do you hope that our audience takes away from your message today?
I hope that your audience takes away that one, racial discrimination in BIPOC communities can really impact mental health, and really doing some education for yourself around what that might look like for your clients or for that community. Also, something else we didn't talk about, but I wanted to point out, I know a lot of us are CBT and behavioral focused and things like that. And I think when clients open up about these experiences, that's not the time to use thought reframing or look at it as thought distortions, right? So also looking at some of the interventions we have when addressing these things, and making sure that we're validating and acknowledging and helping to create shifts in a way that is beneficial to the client but doesn't invalidate their experience. So the second thing, understanding how to address stigma, where it comes from in different communities, and bringing that into the treatment room from the very beginning, and being open to talking about that. And then third, just really being open to having these conversations with all of your clients, right? Because I think that many people are being affected right now on different levels. This is not anything new for many communities of color, but everybody still needs to know that they have a safe place to talk about these things, and that the therapist can tolerate it, and that they're not going to be in a position where they have to shield or protect their therapist.
Yeah, so important. And I definitely continue to hear that message throughout. And, we just recorded a podcast with Elizabeth McCorvey, and, she really talked about the first step is doing your own work, right? And so there's a simultaneous process of doing your own work and stepping into it, and it not being perfect, and messing up and doing some more work, right? So I think the message is not to hesitate and start making some of these changes. And I really hope that, Kimberly's message today really inspired some places for you guys to look at your practice, whether it be how are you marketing, what does your intake look like, what questions are you asking or not asking, and if there's still some discomfort there, is definitely check out some of the resources that have been discussed, whether it's the book White Supremacy and Me, White Fragility by Rob D'Angelo. Those are good places to start and really understanding. Kimberly, I'm curious, I know that you teach at a college, but do you have like online courses that people can actually access your course, or is it just at a university?
Right now, it's just at the university.
Okay.
But my free giveaway today is actually a free 20-minute coaching consultation to any therapist that maybe wants some guidance or to discuss how to implement some of this that we talked about today into their practice and into their work.
Awesome. And how can people get in touch with you?
So they can visit my website at www.kimberlybondsgrocer.com. And you can send me an email or a message through the website. I'm also on Psychology Today. And yeah, therapyforblackparents.com.
Awesome. And we'll put all that in the show notes so people can just go to the show notes page to access that. Thank you so much, Kimberly, for being here with us and talking about this topic, as it's so important. And again, I think my message at the end of this is always like, get into action. And you know what? Just do it anyways. Next week, we are bringing back Dr. Sean Davis. Sean was actually, I think, number 4 on our podcast, or 1 maybe. He was one of our initial podcast guests. And interestingly enough, is we recorded this episode right before COVID hit. So hopefully we're going to be getting back to this someday. And his topic is how counselors can get paid to travel. And he was actually, I think, in Mexico, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
Recording the podcast, taking therapists on not a retreat, but I forget exactly what he called it.
It was a retreat. Okay. It was a retreat. Yeah, it was one of his writing retreats, and it was just as COVID was hitting, and there was a lot of anxiety about whether they were going to be able to get back into the country, and all sorts of things. So it's interesting timing, because we've obviously changed around the order of podcasts to be able to deliver the most relevant content to Startup Nation. And although we recorded his back in probably late February, early March, it's, here we are just now releasing it in August. So there's a lot of moving and shaking and all sorts of things. So we hope you guys are enjoying the podcast. And Kimmy, it's so great to see you. And I loved having you on for this topic today. Such an important topic. Thank you for sharing your perspective and all your expertise and experience with us. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge our Startup Nation superhero shout out for this week, which is actually a private practice marketing e-course alumni as well. Her name is Elizabeth Olivares, and Elizabeth says, I took the marketing e-course and coaching program, and I can say that it changed everything for me. I was at the very beginning of opening my private practice. I didn't even have an office space yet, and I'm writing this at about 1 month post finishing the course, and I have an office space, a completed website, more knowledge about the business side of things than I would have ever known in a 90-day marketing plan to continue growing my business. The greatest part is the confidence I have gained in knowing my business is set up the right way from the very beginning. Thank you, Kate and Katie. So much love to you both. And it's interesting because we actually had Elizabeth on for a success story to hear about her journey through private practice. And she filled her practice in 6 months with working with the clients that she absolutely loved the most. So Kim, we're going to have you on for a success story too sometime in the very near future. So Startup Nation, you'll be hearing from Kim again for that round. And in the meantime, we hope you guys stay inspired, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Thanks again, Kim.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed being here today.
Thanks for joining us on The Private Practice Startup. Visit theprivatepracticestartup.com for awesome resources, free trainings, attorney-approved private practice paperwork, and so much more.